Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the American Museum of Fly Fishing. My name is Jim Schottenham, curator of the museum, and I'm coming to you from the Gardner Grant Library here in Manchester, Vermont. We're going to talk about a number of different reels today that are in some of the museum's collections. Of course, some things that I found rather interesting, some discoveries I've made, and I have a few informational tidbits that I think a lot of people, especially reel collectors, are going to find very interesting. So with that, I think we're going to get started. The benefit of my job, of course, is that I get to play with antique fishing tackle just about every day. So while I'm looking through the holdings of the American Museum of Fly Fishing, I'm able to discover some really neat, unusual, and rare items. And we'll start off with something I think is really kind of cool. This is, I'll move my screen up here for you. There we go. You can all see that. This is an Edward von Hoff Peerless Model 350 trout reel. Now, what's a little bit different about this particular reel, as opposed to the standard Model 355, this reel lacked German silver protective bands around the hard rubber side plates. This reel is also a bit unusual in that it has aluminum components, such as the spool flanges, the handle, the foot, and the sliding oil cap on the tail plate. And you can see that part of the reason that they sold this reel with those protective bands, right about here, there's a chip that resulted in someone either dropping the reel or something happened to it, unfortunately, but still a very rare piece. These reels were featured in the von Hoff catalog of 1889. The Model 350 stayed in the catalog line until about 1907. Model 355, of course, continued almost the entire length of von Hoff catalogs, but this Model 350, which this particular example being lightweight, weighs in, I believe I weighed this one at 2.8 ounces, as opposed to a standard Model 355, which would have weighed in somewhere around 4 ounces. Now, it's interesting, too, that von Hoff offered in their catalogs a special order aluminum version. While that was a special order, the reel was made entirely out of aluminum, the side plates included. So this Model 350 was more of an economy line, if you will, of the Peerless series of reels. It sold for a little bit less than the 355. So when you couple the short length of time, relative short length of time that this reel was sold, the fact that it lacked those German silver bands, more common in the Model 355, it makes for a rather elusive reel. This is not something that you're going to find in every antique tackle store. Okay, so that I think is a really interesting piece. And folks, I just want to apologize in advance. I'm working to try to get some of the images up on the screen so that you can see, but I did want to show you that we do in fact have the reel here. Try to get the zoomed up a little bit so you can see that little area of that rim. It's not really shown up. You can see it right about here, but it's a lovely reel. And again, it's a pretty scarce piece. The next reel we're going to talk about is a Charles Orvis Model 1874. And I'm going to get some pictures up here for you in just a second. The reel that I have is a bit different than your standard Orvis 1874 patent reel. Start this up now. And there we are. So this reel differs from the standard Model 1874 patent reel in that it has a spool that's removable. So you see that center screw there. That actually comes out, and the reel is actually configured more like your modern day fly reel. The Orvis reels, when they were first produced, had a frame that was connected via rivets. The spool was enclosed inside. It wasn't something that was removable. The other feature of those early German silver reels, not plated reels, the German silver reels, is that they had a spindle that was exposed through the tailplate here. Now, I want to point out and have you guys pay attention. There's the hole pattern is a little bit different. That hole right there is a different diameter. It's a little bit smaller. And that would have been a location for a click rivet or a place to secure the click spring and gear mechanism. That is something, and we'll get to the inside here in a second. I also want to point out that this is kind of a hybrid in that the earliest Orvis reels were signed on the foot, as opposed to the later examples that were stamped on the tailplate. So with this particular reel, you can see that it is signed on the foot. You can see that grasp. That grasp is not removable. That's another unusual feature about this particular reel. There's a counterbalance at the end of that, on the opposite side. But here you can see there is the click spring, there is a click wheel, but there is no pawl. And that would have been where the pawl would have gone had they installed it on this reel. So I believe that this is something that was an experimental piece. It came to the museum in the 1960s as a part of a large number of artifacts that came directly from Orvis. So it's more, rather, this is certainly unusual for a lot of those reasons. One of the things that historians have always, well, at least recently struggled with, there's always been speculation about who actually manufactured the reels for Orvis. And it was reported in a 1970 Fly Fisherman magazine by Warren Shepard. Warren is a past trustee of the museum. Warren wrote an article about antique reels, and in it, he included a bit of a snippet about the Orvis reels and where they were made. And he very clearly stated that the reels were early on made by the Manhattan Brass and Manufacturing Company. He went into great detail about how much the reels were going to cost Orvis, about the tooling fees, but he never really cited his source. The information from 1970 up until recently had been repeated. However, no one was actually able to put their hands on an original copy of this invoice. After a few years, there were suspicions that this may have been just a story that sounded good and just had been repeated. Well, after coming to the museum last January, I made it one of my missions to find this documentation. And certainly, as you can see on your screen, I was able to find that invoice. This is a letter that was written from the Manhattan Brass Manufacturing Company to Charles F. Orvis. And I'm going to spare you the strain of trying to read that fancy script on that small screen, because I do think the text is important. The letter is addressed to Orvis. Sir, we yesterday expressed 101 reels, one of them brass sample, by mistake of our P maker, and I believe that could be short for pattern maker. The reels were marked with your name instead of P.W. Orvis as directed. You will please transfer it to him. And I'm going to break here for just a moment. P.W. Orvis was Charles F. Orvis's nephew, and we're going to get back to him in just a moment. We are at work on the balance of reels and will finish this month. Should you need more before they are all finished, let us know and we'll forward another 100. We find that notwithstanding, we have spent over $1,050 more on the tools than you paid us. We are unable to make the reels for the price estimated, and no future lots shall have to have more for them. The exact price we can better tell when the whole lot, I'm assuming lots, are complete. Lest the advance will not be great. Don't think over 30 or 40 cents each for the plated. This advance we find by comparison with the price of reels now on the market is comparatively little. And you will still have made the cheapest and best reel in the market. We have less, I'm not sure what the next word is, this first lot, but notwithstanding have done all the work in the very best possible manner. And as we are well assured, you'll get a large price for the reels. We do not think it would be out of place to ask you to make us whole on the tools. We cannot, of course, insist on this, but state the facts and leave the matter to you. We will give you a memorandum of tools in a day or two. That's proof positive. Manhattan Brass Manufacturing Company produced these early reels for Orvis. The Manhattan Brass Manufacturing Company was in New York City. So technically the early Orvis reels were made in New York, but certainly marketed by Charles F. Orvis. Now, in terms of Paul W. Orvis. In 1875, Charles F. Orvis assigned half of the rights to his patent to his nephew, who was listed in early city directories as a hotel. At one point, he was a manager, but nonetheless, he was Charles F. Orvis's nephew. And I think it's rather interesting that for the grand sum of $5, Charles F. Orvis awarded him half rights to that reel. So I thought that was pretty significant too. Okay, so here is that little Orvis reel. As you can see, and here rather, it doesn't have a click because that pawl is not installed. It is a standard size. It is a narrow spool reel signed on the bottom. I believe it was Steve Vernon that was quoted as saying that the Billinghurst reel, the first fly reel patented in the United States, is considered the grandfather of fly reels, but that the Charles Orvis, which is more in line with a conventional style, is certainly the father of all modern day fly reels. The reels, as they were configured, were cataloged through about to 1915. So for a period of about 40 years, the Orvis reel was available to the buying public. The documentation that shows that Charles Orvis contracted with the Manhattan Brass Manufacturing Company isn't the only revelation I have for you today. And I'm going to pull up our next reel. And that would be the reel of Edward Follett of Rochester, New York. And give me just one moment. Okay, let's do that. Here we go. Make sure I can scroll through. All right. So this is a side-mounted reel produced by Edward Follett. Early on, patents were applied to protect the rights of the reel makers in the U.S. And the Follett reel, though advertised as patented Follett reel, never had a patent in the U.S. Patent Office. Reel historians for years have been trying to determine if a patent existed. Jim Brown did some research when writing A Treasury of Reels. A.J. Campbell spoke about the lack of patent in his book on antique fishing tackle. And it was suspected that instead of incurring the cost, which, by the way, in the 1860s and 1880s, when this would have been patented, it was a whopping $35 to apply for a patent. The thought was that perhaps he was trying to save a few dollars, and by claiming it was patented, stave off any other competitors from making a reel similar. So there you have a Follett reel, side-mounted fly reel in the United States from Rochester that seemingly never received a patent. Well, there's a very good reason for that. Paperwork was discovered in an auction estate in Pennsylvania right around the year 2000. A collector purchased the lot of paper from the estate of one Charles Stroger. Mr. Stroger was a patent attorney in central New York, was a friend of Edward Follett, and in fact, Mr. Stroger's brother enlisted with Edward when he joined the cavalry. So he was very familiar with his friend Charlie. Edward sent Charlie numerous letters, one of which contained these drawings. These are the patent drawings of Edward Follett's idea for his reel. The letters never made it past his neighbor. And in fact, and again, I'm going to spare you the trouble of trying to read through that, Mr. Follett, to his neighbor, included the paperwork that you just saw and said, "Friend Charlie, enclosed, please find $5 for which you will give me credit. I heard by the way of Osgood, another patent attorney in the Rochester area, that you were up here when I was east." He also goes on to talk about the ability to make the reels in massive quantities. In fact, this is the envelope that the letters came in. And you can see Charles Stroger, Esquire. He continues in another letter to say that he has finally got to work on making the fish reel. He has a shop at 111.5 North Water Street in the basement of the Stewart Building. He started to continue on and said that he has the very best machinery for making them and can turn them out 500 per day if I can find sale for them. Yes, that was his use of words. So he clearly had every intention of seeing that patent through. In fact, you'll notice on his advertisement here, very clearly the word patented. So he sent a $5 deposit with the patent drawings. Of course, the patent office at that time did not require a patent example, so you could submit your paperwork and your letters. Intended to get this reel to the patent office, or the design to the patent office, and receive his patent. Went ahead and had all the paperwork done up that claimed that the reel, of course, was patented. So because Mr. Stroger apparently was a bit of a pack rat, for whatever reason, we don't exactly know why, but never forwarded that information on to the patent office. Instead, it stayed at his Webster, New York address. So I'm sure Mr. Follett wasn't altogether too happy about that. I don't believe that he used Mr. Stroger in his future patents, which, by the way, was from 1889. And for this particular reel that was patented by Mr. Follett, he did receive a patent using the patent firm of Charles Osgood. So Mr. Osgood did, in fact, apply properly to the patent office, and he did, in fact, receive his patent for the reel. This is an automatic reel that you'll notice is built into a handle, and you'll see that there's no rod here at the end. That's because it was sold with this nifty little attachment that actually is threaded, screws into the end of the rod, and you would supply your own bamboo or steel section of rod. So I'm going to close this out for you and give you a look at the Follett patent from 1889. And it's unusual in that you'll notice it has this little plunger. The way this reel worked, you would have the reel underneath the rod. As you fold the line off of the spool, there is a tiny little hole in this plunger. By depressing the plunger, the line would be able to pass through. When you release the plunger, it stops the line. Work again. There we go. It pinches the line, preventing it from coming back on the spool. So as you're retrieving your line, you would again depress that plunger, and the spring-loaded reel, the spring is in the body here, would wind that line back on. So this is the proper way to hold one of these early Follett automatic reels, which is kind of a neat piece. So the whereabouts of the patent for Edward Follett's reel, as I said, never actually got to the patent office. Here is the example. It's a reel. It's constructed rather simply. There are two stamped halves, which is very likely why Follett believed that he could pump out 500 of these a day. With very simple construction. The foot and the line guard are all incorporated into one piece. You have these two spool halves simply sandwiched together and held on by a single screw into the back of the foot. The handle is in a fixed position and there is no click. A little bit of a line guard, as I said, incorporated into the foot. So very simple reel manufacture. That's why there's no patent. There should have been. There should have been. And the next item up on our list today is a reel by Elmer J. Sellers and his basket reel. The Sellers reel has the distinction of being the last of the side-mounted reels patented in the United States. So I'm going to bring up that for you here in just a second. And let's close this out. Close that out. And through the magic of the internet, there we are. That is a Sellers basket reel, patented in 1934. There are some misconceptions about this as well, and for quite a while, probably due to the lack of supply of these reels, it was suspected that Mr. Sellers was making these in his basement, or not his basement, in his drugstore. Forgive me, in his drugstore in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. In an auction in 2014 in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, the auction house Spook and Pook had a number of items that were auctioned off that had come from the seller's estate. Included in the estate and in the auction were a number of papers from Elmer J. Sellers and a number of reel parts. The papers revealed quite a bit. They actually told us that the reels were very likely assembled by a gentleman named S.A. Weddy. What you're looking at here is the patent papers and patent drawing that was submitted to the patent office. And you'll notice that it looks very similar to the Follett reel that we just looked at. It has a cage design, side-mounted reel. Sellers' handle is a bit unusual in that it folds down. I'll bring that up for you in just a second. But here is a copy of that agreement between Mr. Sellers and Mr. Weddy. In this agreement, Mr. Sellers was paying for all of the tooling, all of the parts, and Mr. Weddy was to build these parts and assemble the reels for them. This agreement also included one other company that's outlined in the agreement, but the bulk of the reels were to be manufactured by S.A. Weddy. Now, the Sellers reels, rather, let me stop this share for a second. So here we have the Elmer J. Sellers production reel. It's a side-mounted affair, as you can hear. It has a click with a quick switch on top. And here's that handle I was referring to. It's actually a little tulip wood handle that folds down, so that if you wanted to put this in your pocket, it would fit neatly in the pocket. Pop the handle back up, screw the post down so that it's in a fixed position, and you're ready to go fishing. Now, what's unusual is that this reel, again, the design is very similar to that of the Follett reel, but it also looks quite a bit like an early Billinghurst reel. Billinghurst patented his reel in 1859. This reel was patented in 1934. It's surprising that Mr. Sellers decided to patent a side-mounted basket cage reel like this in 1934. The side-mounted reels had fallen out of favor quite a while ago, perhaps some 30 years or so. And the other thing that's interesting is part of the estate from Mr. Sellers revealed one of his early prototype reels. This reel, as you'll notice, is a little bit different. It's not produced by a couple of halves. All of those rings, much like the very first Billinghurst reels, are separate, and they would have required someone to solder every one of the connections to that frame. So these little reels come off. So they'd have to put those connections together. That would take an awful lot of work. These rings would connect all of the ends of those little tiny circles that make up the spool. So I think he realized pretty quickly that that wasn't going to work very well. Part of the estate from Mr. Sellers included a number of pieces that he had that clearly showed his thought process behind the ultimate production reel. And I think this is a neat little piece. This is a piece of tin. And you'll notice that the tin is simply cut, and he formed a little crude spool, or at least a portion of the spool. So this shows his idea of, instead of using all these 20 little rings with countless soldering joints that you'd have to put together, he got the idea after playing with this little piece of tin about redesigning the spool. As for the click mechanism that he has inside the reels, this is a neat little piece. And again, another little piece of tin that shows a little click pawl and a little click spring. And on the backside, there's the switch. So he was experimenting with how to get his click and click gear working. The spools themselves that were ultimately made by Mr. Weddy and assembled, he opted to go for a couple of different spool halves. So much like the Follett reel, you'd simply put these two, sandwich them together, and you would end up with a spool that you could utilize, put your cap on, attach the foot, put the line guard on, and you've got a seller's reel. So it's interesting that the sellers decided that the design that started in 1859 with the Billinghurst reel, utilizing that cage, that's where he started, changed his design to be more like Edward Follett, who we just talked about, in that there are spool halves, like the Follett, that would simply be put together. But the patent office approved the patent. So Mr. Sellers had himself a patent for his reel. There aren't very many of them out there in the collecting world. And it's interesting because he did, in fact, try to market his reel. And I'll share the screen here for you. Let's see. There we are. So this is the brochure that came with all of Sellers reels. You can see that it's called the fly casting basket reel. He had a US patent, and of course, the patent for Canada was still pending. And some of the things that he touts about his new invention is that the open basket idea, he talks about the 20 semicircular bars arranged in 2 sets to make up the spool. He talks about the large surface and exposure to air and sunlight to help dry, all of which had been, of course, patented and explained in the Billinghurst examples beforehand. So as I said, the reel kind of fell out of favor, but that didn't stop Mr. Sellers from trying to mass market his reel. And in fact, part of the paperwork that, thanks to the Historical Society in Kutztown, Pennsylvania, they have copies of a letter that was addressed to the Shakespeare Company. And in this letter from William Shakespeare Jr., that was sent back to Elmer Sellers, explaining that he did receive a couple of the samples that he sold, although apparently Mr. Sellers was not clear as to his intentions. But I find it interesting that Sellers clearly wanted to get his reels out into a much larger market. I'm willing to bet that the Shakespeare Corporation, that Mr. Shakespeare said that he was going to show these to his son, and they would talk about it. It never got off the ground. Subsequently, I don't think very many of these reels were sold other than through Sellers' own drugstore in Kutztown, Pennsylvania. So for that reason, they're a bit scarce. There's not a lot of reels out there. But again, I find it interesting that he did try. We have evidence here as a result of this letter. Unfortunately, I don't have the other copies of the correspondence between Shakespeare and Sellers. I'm hoping that the folks at the Kutztown, Pennsylvania Historical Society will be able to find those letters for us and get those to us. Okay. Okay, so that's what we have on the Elmer J. Sellers reel. Next up, reach over here, bear with me for just 1 second. Okay. Next up, we have a reel. It's kind of a standard New York style reel. Everyone that's interested in early reels, of course, is familiar with the New York ball handle style reels, but not very many people are aware that some of the models of ball handle reel were actually designed for use as a fly reel. This was an early New York ball handle reel, but you'll notice that the handle is mounted in the center, as opposed to an offset handle that would indicate a multiplying gear ratio. Now, the reason that this is likely centered, as any fly fisherman will tell you, when you're stripping line off your reel, you have all this line laying at your feet. The last thing you want is that line to get entangled behind the handle, because the first time that fish takes a run, the line would get caught on that handle and it would lock up. You'd have nothing to prevent that fish from breaking the line. The center mounted handle, as you can see, would act to prevent that line from getting behind. It's not impossible to get back there, but it certainly made life a lot easier for trout fishermen to be able to use this as a fly reel. This dates back to about the 1880s. Then again, these are certainly less common than their multiplying cousins. So that's a neat little reel. Let's see if I can get you a better photograph so you'll be able to see here. Just so that you can get a much better look at it than let's do that. And there we are. That's our little New York style ball handle reel. And there's no click and no drag. These are very simple machines. Oftentimes you'll find them fitted with a little leather thumb drag on the leather pad to put pressure on the spool, and that would act as your drag. So, okay. Okay, I'm back. Next up, another early reel, and something that I'm rather fond of because it is also a New York reel, and it's a first of its kind, at least in the United States. So the Francis Loomis automatic reel, there's an example of that reel here. The automatic reel, and I should start out by saying that one of the misconceptions that modern day anglers have about the automatic reel, the reel was never intended to bring a fish to your hand. Rather, it was only to bring in that slack line to prevent entanglement, the shock of a fish making a run and breaking your line. So it was only intended to, as your line was stripped out, it would wind the reel. It was only intended to keep that line from becoming entangled. It was never to bring the fish right to your hand. So I've got some photos here I'm going to share for you. This. Okay. Okay, there we are. So this is the first automatic fly reel patented in the United States. This reel dates to 1880. The patent was assigned to Francis Loomis before his association with James Plumb. The association came about shortly after the introduction of his reel. And you'll notice that this is a little different from some of the other early automatic reels. This hard rubber head plate is completely unmarked. The markings are found on this finger brake on the underside of the reel, and it carries only the US date of 1880, the Canadian date being a little bit later. In his brochure, this is also a very early piece. You'll notice that this, of course, incorporates Loomis and Plumb from Syracuse, New York. I find, and I had to share this drawing on the back of the early catalog, just to give you an idea of how these reels were used. And you can see here the little finger lever, you can see my mouse arrow. That's what would release the tension that this finger brake would apply to the spool. If you were to lift up on that finger brake, you would allow the spring tension from the line to be able to bring that line back up on the reel. So this circular was dated 1882, and I find it interesting that they talk about the reel's origins as not being exactly perfect. Sounds like they may have been a little hurried in their production, and with the inclusion of Plumb, I think they were able to improve vastly on the reel. So there's a little bit of quite a difference actually between the very first versions cosmetically and the subsequent versions made by Loomis and Plumb. The Loomis and Plumb reels ultimately sold out to the company of Yeoman and Irby. Yeoman and Irby ran the automatic reel division for quite a few years before finally selling out to Horrocks and Ibbotson of New York State. So the automatic reels have a long history in New York State, and that Francis Loomis is the first of its kind. I think that's an interesting piece. Okay. I'll go back on screen for you here. There I am. Okay, So from one automatic reel to another, a fairly recent acquisition from the museum, I think is really, really neat. It is a Martin automatic reel. Now, I know there's quite a few people that think an automatic reel from Martin isn't all that exciting. However, I think you'll agree once you see this reel, it's very special. So I will bring that folder up for you here. And there we go. The reel belonged to Fly Rod Crosby. Fly Rod, of course, was one of the pioneers of fly fishing in Maine. And in fact, she has the distinction of earning Maine Guide Badge #1. Now, despite never being a guide herself, Fly Rod Crosby worked to promote Maine guides from having to pay a fee. It's something that she lobbied for, and she was successful. So as kind of a way to reward her, she was given the first license in 1898. Now, leading up to that, she had worked for a couple of newspapers, writing columns. Her columns were very popular. She would talk about fishing mostly, and ultimately talking about convince the railroads to kind of hire her to promote tourism and the fishing opportunities in Maine. And to do this, Fly Rod Crosby spent a fair amount of time at the sportsman shows in New York City and went so far as to construct a cabin at these shows, complete with fish mounts, hunting mounts. Anglers, Fly Rod herself would show up at these shows and, of course, promote the fishing and be able to talk about it to anyone that was interested. Now, sharing that experience at the sportsman shows was the Martin Automatic Reel Company, at the time called the Martin Novelty Works. And this particular reel was given to Fly Rod Crosby. And you'll notice that it's a little bit unusual in that it has a seam on the winding plate. It was given to her in 1897. And I suspect that they were hoping to get Fly Rod Crosby's endorsement so that she would perhaps write about the company and the reels in her columns. And while this isn't necessarily the most flattering image, if in fact it's supposed to be Fly Rod Crosby, I suspect it is. This design, I'm going to give you a little bit of a close-up here. You'll notice that she's hooked a boot, not a fish. So she has a net. She's ready to bring that boot into the net. Now, this is a special reel, not because it's simply a Martin automatic, but it was something that was presented to Fly Rod Crosby. The etching that you see on those plates was something that was offered through Martin through the early catalogs. This is a catalog from the Ilion New York Company. And inside this catalog, they offered, for a price, of course, a number of designs. So you could purchase a reel. I suspect you could probably send them your own design. Obviously, they had the ability to do that, or you could select from a number of samples that they provided in the catalog. The Martin Company started with their patents in 1892. So they've been around for a long time. In fact, they were the longest in terms of longevity. They outlasted many of their competitors. The Martin reels were made up into the 2000s. I am not certain. I don't believe that the current owners of the company are making an automatic reel. Martin does offer a fly reel, but I don't believe it's an automatic. So I'll show you that reel in person here. And it came in the original box. And you can see this Fly Rod's image. So the winding plate on this reel, you would wind it, and by depressing the finger lever, it would bring that line back in. So again, as I mentioned when talking about the Loomis reel, these were never intended to bring a fish to your hand, rather just to bring that slack line and prevent a fish from breaking you off. That was the advantage that they had over some of the other reels. Okay, up next, let's see what I have on my list here. Oh yes, up next we have a reel from another New York maker. This is a gentleman that for years kind of kind of flew under the radar as a real maker, mostly because he very rarely signed his work. Most other reel makers, of course, are very proud. You'll find Vom Hoff's name stamped on their reels. You'll find Martin's name on their reels and so on. But the reels from John Kopp are, for the most part, unmarked. He would, from time to time, produce reels that had the patent date stamped on them. And I'm going to show you an example of that. I appreciate your patience while I bounce from screen to screen here. And there we go. That is a little John Kopp trout reel. The patent for this reel is from 1884, and specifically the patent is for the frame of the reel, as opposed to standard trout reels that had side plates that would have to be riveted together at the foot. The Kopp reel was actually made from a one-piece frame, which you can easily see here. So you have your spool flanges that are incorporated into the foot and simply folded up and attached with a couple of pillars. There are no foot pillars here. If not for the patent date that's stamped on the head plate here, you wouldn't have any idea who this maker was. Kopp reels were sold through a number of retailers across the country, and he had some pretty unique designs, and he was certainly prolific. He made a lot of reels for a lot of companies for a long time, but very rarely signed them. So if you're out in the field and you happen to see a reel that's made from one piece, even without that patent date stamp, you'll know that you found yourself a John Kopp reel. They did offer these in a couple of sizes. This is a little number 4 size reel, and it has a really nice sounding click. I'm going to turn this off, and you can hear a great little click sound, and you can see that this is a little guy. It's a number 4 size, has a screw off cap on the tail end side, and that was so that you could apply a little bit of oil to keep the reel lubricated a little bit. But again, it's a very neat little piece. I just think that little folded frame is, I think that's really cool. I think it's a great little reel. Okay. Slide over and grab my next piece here. Next up, we're gonna go across the pond to England, and another reel that I think is kind of interesting because it's a little bit unusual from its contemporaries. The reels from Peter Malik. I'm going to bring that folder up for you here. Okay. And there we are. This particular reel is what they call a sun and planet reel. It's a bronze brass finish. This was a reel that was patented early on. This, I believe, is a 1910 patent. What's unusual about this is the handle and the gearing on this reel. So most reels, and some people are familiar with the term knuckle buster. Knuckle busters pretty much are self-explanatory in that when you hook a fish, especially a big fish like a salmon, if it were to make a run using a reel that had a fixed handle and a single action spool like that, that handle would rotate very rapidly. If you got your fingers anywhere near that rapidly rotating spool and handle, you would certainly bust your knuckles. So the Malik reel is a bit different in that this handle will actually act as a bit of a brake. So as the spool is releasing line, this winding plate stays stationary and the handle actually turns. So I'll show you how that works here. Yeah. So this is the sun and planet reel. And very loud click, but as you'll notice, if I turn the handle, I'll try to get that view for you. I'm spinning the handle, that spool is actually rotating so that when line is coming out, I can simply hold on to this grasp the handle itself will turn as the spool is feeding out line. In order to retard the spool rotation, like the angler could simply grab onto this grasp while the spool is being played out, and you could adjust the tension by keeping this from rotating. So much easier to adjust the speed by grabbing this grasp as opposed to sticking your hand inside the spool flanges. Constant check, so it is rather noisy. There's certainly no question if you had a fish taking line off your reel. And you can grab my next reel. The next item that I'd like to talk about really doesn't need any introduction. The Hardy Perfect reels have been around for over 130 years. I think that this particular example, and I've got it here in my hand, I'm going to show you a much clearer image here in just a second. These reels, as I said, were introduced in 1891. So they've been around for an awful long time. There certainly have been some design changes over the years, but this particular reel dates back to the early times. It is referred to as a second model with a line guide that covers roughly a little more than half of the spool diameter. What's unique about these reels also, these are marked with a serial number, but when you take this reel, if you were to take it apart, this plate unwinds, and underneath, and forgive me for not doing this while we're live here, it's because there's a race of ball bearings underneath that winding plate that are not held in place with anything other than gravity. So if you were to unwind this reel and not know that those little tiny ball bearings were hiding under there, they would quickly scatter and disperse in your carpet, your hardwood floors. It doubt very much you'd find them quickly, if at all. So the early reels are coveted by collectors, especially the 1890s versions. The Hardy reels, again, this particular Perfect, they've gone through a lot of different design changes, but for the most part, they've been a staple for fly anglers all over the world. They certainly enjoy popularity here in the States, just as much, if not more so, than, of course, in Britain. But they are a worldwide known reel, and very, very collectible, especially in some of these early configurations. So let's stop that. Here we are. The early reels also have a little logo, and I'm going to try to get the light just right. And that's called the Rod and Hand logo. It's right here. I'm not sure how well that's focusing, but you have to take my word for it. It's there. The raised pillars on this reel serve only to hold on this line guard, this nickel silver line guard. It has a very early strapped tension screw that would, just as it sounds, it would apply tension so that the reel doesn't spin rather freely. And of course, you'll notice that the spool face has a lot of large perforations. And as we discussed earlier, with some of the side mounted reels that had an open spool, that was to help the line dry while it stayed on the reel. In this particular reel, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see that. Let's try to do this. There's some perforations. There we go. You can see some perforations on that spool arbor. And again, that was so that air could get to the early lines. They didn't have monofilament back in the 1890s. So the line would have to be taken off the reel at the end of the day's fishing. If you didn't, it would rot, grow mold. Lines are very expensive. So it was in the angler's best interest to keep his lines dry. So that's a brief history of the early patent reels from Hardy. And last up on my list for today is somewhat unusual, and it is a raised pillar reel from France. This particular reel, I'll get you a much better image here. What's that? Open this. Go back here. I'll share that with you. And there we go. So that is a French reel. This is about 1900, late 1890s, 1900. It's a reel from Wales. The French name for this reel was Wales Frères, and Frères is French for brothers. There were a total of 4 brothers involved in the manufacture, but it's unusual to find a reel from England or Europe that had raised pillars. The raised pillar design was patented in 1877 by James Philbrook of the Philbrook and Payne raised pillar reels that I don't think there are very many reel collectors that are not familiar with those 1877 patent reels. But the raised pillars would allow the angler to fill the spool completely with line. Those pillars didn't get in the way, so you had a little greater capacity. So for whatever reason, this design didn't really catch on in Europe. So finding a reel with a raised pillar design from Europe or from Britain is a bit unusual. And the fact that this is from France, there aren't too many reels, antique reels from France. And they also, the brothers had a factory in Redditch, but this was from their Paris division. So constant check. Here. I'll come back to you. There we are. Again, constant check. You can hear that click. Revolving plate, and you can see those raised pillars and standard kind of style click. No drag, just that click. That was the only thing that you had for retarding the speed of your line. So again, those raised pillar reels are a little unusual, not so much in the United States, but certainly from Europe. So that's what we have today. I thank everyone for joining, and see if we have any questions. That we're all good. Fantastic. What I would like to do at this time, of course, is welcome anyone that's not already a member of the American Museum of Fly Fishing, certainly to join. We have an amazing collection. We always welcome people to the Manchester Museum here. We also invite you to visit our campus in Springfield, Missouri, that was recently opened. We have a number of artifacts down there, including 3 walls full of interesting reels for everyone to look at. So I certainly encourage that. I also encourage anyone that's interested in antique reels to look into joining the Old Reel Collectors Association, known as ORCA. That's an organization that focuses on antique reels. In fact, members of the Old Reel Collectors Association will be making a trip here to Manchester in September, and certainly the members-only event. Certainly could include you if you're a member of the museum or a member of ORCA. So they're certainly going to be coming out. Lastly, I'd like to suggest 2 particular books if you're interested in collecting old reels. The first is A Treasury of Reels. It was written by Jim Brown in conjunction with the museum. It's a fantastic book that will list the reels from the museum's holdings. And there's a number of photographs, but Jim has done an amazing job of documenting a lot of the history of some of the early reels. And speaking of early reels, the other book I'd recommend is from author and reel historian Steve Vernon on antique fishing reels. Steve has a newer book that's out, and again, I recommend it highly. It's a fantastic work, numerous photographs, especially if you're researching any reel patents. That's definitively the book to go to. So again, I thank everyone for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed it, hope you learned something, and I hope to see you here in Manchester.